Leading a flight of A-4 Skyhawks, Lieutenant James McBride was en route back to the USS Shangri-La after completing a routine mission when suddenly the voice of a forward air controller, or simply FAC, came through his headset.
How many rounds of 20 Mike are you carrying?
The FAC had just spotted a Viet Cong supply barge tucked away in one of South Vietnam's many narrow inland waterways. FAC's job was to tightly coordinate airstrikes in Vietnam to ensure civilian areas were not accidentally targeted. The controller, flying an Cessna A-1 Bird Dog, was now deciding which of the many available flights in the region should be called in to attack the barge. McBride quickly responded,
Be advised that we have around 400 rounds of unused 20 Mike.
He anticipated that his group of attack aircraft would soon receive the order. Before directing an airstrike, it was common for the FAC to ask about the current fuel and how much 20mm cannon ammunition was available.
Copy that, thank you, sir.
The FAC replied. McBride was ready to receive instructions to engage the target, but an unexpected response came.
We won't need you today.
His Skyhawks were fully combat ready. Why weren't they needed? It didn't take long for him to get his answer. Another attack flight from a different carrier reported into the FAC with a much larger stock of 20mm rounds, over 2,000, and for this, they were selected for the mission. It was a frustrating moment for McBride, but also his first introduction to the LTV A-7 Corsair II, a lethal and magnificently accurate ground attack aircraft. The Ling Temco Vought A-7 Corsair II began life as a quick-to-build, economical carrier-borne aircraft to supplement and ultimately replace the A-4 Skyhawk in the ground attack role. Some saw this as a tall order, considering the A-4, designed by one of America's top aeronautical engineers, Edward Heinemann, was at the time the world's most successful aircraft for that task. But before the Corsair II could take over the title from the phenomenal Skyhawk and become a legend in its own right, it first had to overcome numerous hurdles, ranging from lack of power, engine problems, steam-induced compressor stalls, and even a tendency to devour men whole. Still, it would go on to set the standard by which future attack aircraft like the iconic A-10 would be measured. Hello, and welcome back to Aviation Republic. The A-7 Corsair II is one of those aircraft that, for me, ranks up there with the likes of the A-10, Buccaneer, and OV-10 Bronco, when its sheer looks are enough to make you do a double take. Like most of you watching, the A-7 has always interested me, mainly due to some incredible stories about the A-7's time in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, a few of which I cover here. So therefore, I figured why not put together a video and tell the story of the squat, adorable Slough, or short little ugly fella. Yes, I know the F also stood for a naughty word. As always, I don't want YouTube to demonetize the channel. Since you guessed it, I need the shekels. So again, this is the story of how the Slough became a much loved, respected, and legendary aircraft. In 1962, the Navy's attack squadrons were equipped with the nimble Douglas A-4 Skyhawk, also affectionately known as simply Scooter. The A-4 first flew on the 22nd of June 1954 and entered service in October 1956. It was seen as a capable aircraft that could even deliver a nuclear weapon, although some have said this would be a one-way kamikaze mission. But by the early 1960s, the U.S. Navy, which bought aircraft both for itself and for the U.S. Marine Corps, was planning the A-4's replacement, along with replacing the piston-engined, prop-driven A-1 Skyraider, which was designed during World War II and had seen action in the Korean War. Building a replacement for the A-4 was no small order. The light, agile Skyhawk was so loved, respected, and very much needed that it remained on the flight decks and carried on throughout the war in Southeast Asia, even after the Corsair II had been firmly established on most carriers. She was such a successful design that the little scooter would remain in production until 1979. Think about that for a moment. The A-4 first flew 70 years ago. Quite impressive. With the need for a shipborne, nuclear-capable attack aircraft in mind, the Navy went off looking for their new jet, initially kicking off the VAX competition, with V representing heavier than air, A denoting attack, and the X for experimental. However, considering the prospect of another looming Southeast Asian war, they figured that almost half a decade needed to develop a complex VAX design would be too long and costly. What they needed was something that would be easier to manufacture, cheap to buy, and be combat ready as soon as possible. Therefore, the VAX competition was dropped, and in February 1963, a new one was launched, given the Bureau of Weapons designation VAL, where the L stood for light. The goal was to develop a light attack aircraft that could carry 15,000 pounds of external stores and operate from a carrier deck with a 600 nautical mile radius of action, basically hauling an immense and varied payload further than a diminutive A-4. Most of the US Navy's requirements seemed straightforward, although they had three particular demands. Firstly, reliability and maintainability was specified, and it was made clear that penalty clauses in the successful bidder's contract would ensure that the aircraft lived up to the figures quoted. I suppose that the Navy had been let down many times before, that they were going to hold the manufacturer's feet to the fire. Secondly, the early VAX studies had shown that a demand for supersonic penetration would result in a much heavier and more expensive aircraft, so there was no stipulation for the aircraft to be capable of Mach 1 plus speeds. And this was surprising in a day when speed was everything, and the decision to make the VAL subsonic received a lot of criticism. At the time, the F-105 Thunder Chief had been designed to hit ground targets flying supersonic speeds close to the deck, and deliberately creating a subsonic ground attack aircraft when air defenses were becoming increasingly more sophisticated and enemy fighters becoming faster was seen as insanity. The Navy argued that it would be easier to hit targets with greater accuracy if the aircraft was flying subsonically, pointing out that even the fastest fighter bombers had to reduce their rate of knots to below Mach 1 to deliver their ordnance with any accuracy, as most air-to-ground weapons could not be delivered at supersonic speeds. And this logic was backed up by a Ling-Temco-Vought in-house study that confirmed that strike aircraft derive little benefit from flying faster than sound, except when outrunning MiGs. On top of that, the US Navy could not afford to buy supersonic attack aircraft in the numbers desired to equip all its carriers, claiming that it could buy 3 subsonic aircraft for every one of the supersonic types. Here's a funny anecdote. Pentagon analysts did studies into the low attrition rate of the A-7 during combat missions in Vietnam, and this led them to conclude that the North Vietnamese defenses were not as formidable as once thought, not understanding that the A-7 was simply a phenomenally accurate attack aircraft. The third condition laid down by the Navy was that to save time and money in the development phase, all tenders had to be based on existing aircraft. In other words, manufacturers should only submit proposals which were minimum changing modifications of existing aircraft, believing that this was the key to keeping costs down and expediting delivery. This approach also had the advantage that the US Navy could make its selection with a high degree of confidence in the claimed performance figures and in the knowledge that there was virtually no technological risk involved in any of the aircraft proposed. Little did they know, LTV was going to pretty much ignore this stipulation. I want to point out that LTV, or Ling-Temco-Vought, was a conglomerate formed 2 years prior by a union of Ling-Temco Electronics and Chance Vought, although I do have the habit of referring to the company as Vought. Still, for the sake of brevity and accuracy, we will refer to the company as LTV. On the 17th of May 1963, the VAL operational requirements were finally formulated and issued to Douglas, Grumman, North American, and LTV a week later. While researching this story, I couldn't find exact details of the competition. I hear that they've never been fully published. If you have a source, please drop it in the comments. However, in August 1963, Grumman submitted its design, named the G-12, which was to be a single-seat, simplified derivative version of the A-6 Intruder, keeping the twin Pratt & Whitney J-52 turbojets. And Douglas offered an updated version of the A-4, called the A-4D6, which was to be a scooter on steroids. As for North American, I was not able to find much on their proposal. I believe they proposed an upgraded FJ-4B Fury concept named NA-295, with an enlarged fuselage for the TF-30 turbofan engines and strengthened wing to carry 15,000 pounds of stores. sort of a muscular version of the F-86 Sabre. Again, let me know in the comments. Now, here's an interesting tidbit. It was said that the Douglas A-4D6 version of the Skyhawk was going to be a shoo-in for the Val and pretty much destined for production, but LTV caught wind of this and demanded a competition, which Douglas obviously put forward their A-4D6 and lost. No doubt, if true, much to their embarrassment. For their effort, LTV brought together the team that had designed and developed the F-8U Crusader: Russell Clark, Sol Love, William C. Schoolfield, and others. The company approached the task by assembling two design groups called Red Team and Blue Team. Some say it was to compete against each other in the same way that they would be competing against Douglas, North American, and Grumman, although some sources state that the Red Team was responsible for analyzing how the other three manufacturers would redesign and develop their VAL proposals. LTV chose to base their proposal on an aircraft derived from the previously mentioned F-8U Crusader, which had first flown on the 25th of March 1955, and was at this time the Navy's primary fighter, some say the last gunfighter. The new design, now given the company model number V461 and later V463, had a very strong family resemblance to the F-8U. The V463, looking as though someone had taken the Crusader, sat on it, and compressed it accordion style. Whereas the F-8U was a long, sleek-looking, immensely fast machine, the A-7 was short, clunky, and subsonic. Despite the similarity, there appears to have been no significant commonality of parts or equipment. In effect, the V463 was a brand new design that looked sort of generally similar to the F-8U, thus hardly complying with the terms of reference dictated by the Navy to base the VAL on an existing design. LTV probably interpreted the criteria from the Navy as
Make it look like one of your existing aircraft.
rather than base it on an existing one. In any event, in February 1964, LTV's V463 was announced as the winner, and a month later, an initial development contract covering 3 prototype aircraft was awarded to the company. They did not waste any time getting the first full-scale mock-up built with the pointed nose radome of the Crusader by June of that same year, along with the real-looking bombs to show off to the Navy brass. V463 soon received the U.S. Navy designation YA-7, and the company revived the name of its most famous product, calling it the LTV Corsair II, after the wartime F-4U, which was considered by many to have been the most outstanding American fighter of the war. The legendary F-4U Corsair, or bent-wing bird, had stayed in production for 11 years, longer than any other contemporary U.S. fighter. It also saw active service in the Korean War, flying close support missions with the U.S. Marine Corps pilots, sometimes having to carry out their attacks just across the road from friendly troops, and one even shot down a MiG-15. In naming the A-7 after the F-4U, the company was thus wagering its reputation that the new aircraft would be just as much a world beater as the first Corsair. For the record, the first Corsair was not the F-4U, but a much earlier Vought creation called the O-2U-1. In 1926, Chance Vought, the company's founder and namesake, painted the name Vought Corsair on the rudder of the biplane he had just sold to the US Navy, although it was an unofficial name. I believe the US military did not sanction colorful and dramatic names for their aircraft until late 1941. Let me know in the comments. I want to say a big thank you to everyone for taking the time to watch. It means a lot for me to share my love of aviation with like-minded people. However, I have a small favor to ask of you. If you're enjoying this video, please press the like button. This small action makes a world of difference for a small channel like mine. Now back to the story. Mid-1965, LTV had successfully constructed the first flight-ready YA-7A prototype, 1525-80. At this time, the urgency to introduce the YA-7A into active service was growing, with every effort being made to expedite its deployment into combat following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964. The sturdy YA-7 measured 46 feet long and 16 feet tall, with a stocky, robust fuselage built and well suited to attack missions at high subsonic speeds. The airframe had an estimated 4,000-hour fatigue life. However, service experience would prove this number was very conservative. The moderately swept high-set wing, measuring 38.5 feet or 23.5 feet folded, allowed plenty of deck clearance for the many bulky pylon-mounted stores. The tailplanes were all moving, along with a vertical tail sawn off at the top, shortening overall height to fit into carrier hangars, although the retrofitting of a tail ECM antenna fairing later negated this. The A-7 also kept the chin intake of the F-8U, which virtually eliminated problems associated with the fuselage boundary layer present on airframes with lateral intakes. Still, several F-8U features were deleted. The most obvious was the unique but complex variable incidence wing that was abandoned in favor of a steeper deck attitude and larger slotted flaps that provided good low-speed landing performance. There was also a large air brake on the belly. Likewise, the F-8U's afterburning J57 turbojet was replaced by the non-afterburning Pratt & Whitney TF30P6 turbofan, which was then being developed in twin afterburning form for the General Dynamics F-111 and later the F-14. But this engine choice, as it was quickly discovered, turned out to be unquestionably underpowered for the aircraft. Many remarks were made about the TF30P6 powered Corsair, some less than charitable. However, it must be remembered that this engine was the first practical military turbofan power plant, the first real jet propulsion innovation since the turbojet of the 1940s. Despite lacking power, the single engine was able to push the squat A-7A along to a top speed of 578 miles an hour, although this would improve with later types with more powerful turbofans. The early models of the A-7 retained two of the F-8U's 420mm Mark 12 cannon mounted on the sides of the front fuselage and two additional pylons on the fuselage sides for AIM missiles, intended for self-defense in the event that they needed to scare away a MiG or two. Since the A-7 resembled the F-8U and the Pratt & Whitney TF-30 was being flown in the F-111, it was felt that using the single runway at Naval Air Station Dallas was better, convenient, and safe enough than having to take maiden flight at the usual wide-open environment of Edwards Dry Lake bed. So, with that in mind, the first of the pre-production A-7As, 15-25-80, completed two taxi trials on the 20th of September 1965. The second of which saw the prototype lift briefly into the air. However, this short hop was not considered to be the first flight. But before the A-7 could take to the skies, some last-minute technical gremlins were fixed, such as some minor hydraulic issues. It has been said that if the A-7 was not leaking hydraulic fluid, then it generally meant there was no fluid left. On the 27th of September 1965, 15-25-80 took to the air, piloted by LTV Chief Test Pilot John W. Conrad on a near-perfect Texas day. However, carrying a partial fuel load, the first flight was not without drama. Conrad described the A-7's 5-minute-long maiden flight. The flight was very brief. As the aircraft accelerated following liftoff at the planned speed of 180 knots, a general airframe buffet occurred, which increased in magnitude with increasing speed. The chase pilot reported that the horizontal tail were vibrating in a random manner to 2.5 to 3.5 inch amplitude at the tip, together with random shaking of the wing trailing edge flaps. Since the driving force was unknown, a hasty turn was accomplished, followed by a downwind landing on the departure runway. A second flight was performed that same day after a detailed inspection of the aircraft revealed that the flap slot tunnels were obstructed. Fortunately, the vibrations were not due to the design, and flight testing would continue. The second flight took place that day and lasted over an hour. It's incredible to consider that the A-7 got airborne only 18 months after the contract was signed, which is less than half the standard development period for a brand new aircraft, and some 25 days ahead of the official schedule. By the end of that first day, 15-25-80, sitting on the tarmac in the bright Texas sunshine, painted in the standard navy white and gray with red trim, with its long pointy nose, pitot probe, had crossed the first hurdle, What lay ahead was a long flight test program before proving itself under fire over the jungles of Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and later over Lebanon and Grenada. The next day, Conrad strapped into 1525-80 and took off for a third flight, this time with full internal fuel, up to 30,000 feet. On landing, he reported that the engine seemed to lose power at altitude. This came as a bit of a blow, as until this point, even though it was still early days, the YA-7A had only experienced minor teething problems and was pretty much on its way to joining the battle in Vietnam. And now, this flight showed that the aircraft with its TF-30 turbo engine was lacking power. Further flights showed engine thrust decreased to 88% at 34,000 feet, an issue that would continue to plague the TF-30 P6 powered A-7A until the uprated TF-41A1 and the TF-41A2 versions were fitted to the A-7D and E models, respectively. However, some still regarded the re-engined Corsairs as underpowered. It seems you can't please everyone. Although the TF-30 P6 lacked power, its range was really remarkable. However, it did have issues with compressor stalls when it ingested too much steam from carrier deck catapults. More on this later on. In December 1965, only 3 months after the YA-7A's first flight, the US Air Force decided to adopt a modified Corsair as its new tactical jet. In fact, 3 USAF pilots would be part of the initial deployment of the A-7A on the USS Ranger. And this was not the first time the USAF had adopted a Navy design, having previously embraced the F-4 Phantom II. This decision must have had the admirals smiling. The inter-service rivalry was quite intense that for the Air Force to acquire a second Navy aircraft was a testimony to the A-7 and how faster was not always better. So the A-7D, as the Air Force variant was to be known, was to become the first subsonic fighter the service had acquired for 15 years. We will come back to the A-7D in a bit. By the 17th flight, 1525-80 had been flown up to 43,000 feet, reaching just over Mach 1 in a dive, and a little over 600 miles per hour in level flight. Just over a month after the maiden liftoff, the first public demonstration of the Corsair was made. The aircraft was loaded with everything it could carry, having 12 500-pound bombs on the inboard and middle pylons, and 6 250-pound bombs on the outer pylons. 2 sidewinders were also included for the flying demonstration, which consisted of low-speed passes, rolls, and simulated dive bombing, much to the joy of the crowds. While the aircraft was being put through its paces, the ground crew demonstrated the 42 tasks required to remove the TF-30 turbofan engine, a task they accomplished in only 18 minutes, and one of its 20mm Mark 12 cannons in less than 90 seconds. These demonstrations impressed the Navy purchasing officials, which went a long way in helping convince them that the contract requirement of no more than 11.5 maintenance hours per flight hour could be met. During operations, maintenance hours per flight hour were as low as 9.5 hours. This remarkably low maintenance figure was achieved partly by virtue of the designers locating many of the 35 quick-release panels that made up almost half the aircraft's skin area at a level that did not require ladders and platforms. Many of the self-test features were built into the major avionics and systems to improve maintenance times further and eliminate a need for complex ground equipment on the flight line. Not only were the maintainability and delivery schedule covered by penalty clauses, but so was the aircraft's weight. The first aircraft tipped the scale at 15,497 pounds, a few hundred pounds over the 15,037 pound design weight guaranteed in the contract, although LTV exceeded almost every one of its contractual guarantees. In November 1965, the Navy exercised its contract option to purchase a fourth production order for 140 more A-7A airframes without the engines. This order was valued at $91 million, having purchased earlier batches of 3, 4, and 35 aircraft. If you're wondering, the engines were purchased under a separate contract. By January 1966, the Navy Primary Evaluation, or MPE, began to provide a complete analysis of the aircraft, its strengths and weaknesses to prepare it for service, and ultimately combat. As can be imagined, Due to the urgency to get the A-7 to Vietnam, the MP was an active and energetic program, which the 6 A-7 aircraft took in their stride, performing 362 sorties, logging 733 flight hours, with pilots adjusting to the many elaborate black boxes of the sophisticated computerized navigation and weapon systems. As expected in any intense testing program, there would be accidents. The first loss occurred when 1525-80, the first prototype, had engine difficulties, causing the pilot, John Omvig, to eject. Fortunately, he survived. In August 1966, a potentially deadly event ended in bemusement when Lieutenant Richard Birtwistle, flying the third YA-7A prototype, 1525-82, experienced a compressor stall, forcing him to eject. But instead of falling out of the sky, the aircraft continued to fly along just fine, pilotless, making a gear-up landing in a farmer's field, leaving a furrow a few hundred meters long. Amazingly, the fuselage was hardly damaged and was used as a mock-up at the LTV factory once recovered, a testament to the stability and ruggedness of the design. Deliveries to the US Navy began in October 1966, when the A-7A joined the Atlantic Coast Replacement Air Group, or RAG, VA-174 Hellraisers, to train Corsair pilots for the fleet with carrier trials scheduled aboard the USS America. Documents I found show that on the 15th of November 1966, Lieutenant Commander Fred Weber made the first Corsair II landing on a carrier. That week, the A-7 made over 80 catapult launches and landings, and although the tests were going well, they were being performed without heavy fuel and ordnance loads. And despite this, everyone was pleased, but with these things, there is always something unexpected to throw a spanner in the works. While conducting catapult launches on the ground and aboard the USS America, it was discovered that the A-7A would experience compressor stalls when it ingested steam from the catapult system. And this was due to the design of the aircraft, which placed its intake closer to the shuttle that connected it to the catapult for launch. In comparison, other aircraft had the shuttle positioned further back or had a bridle arrangement like the A-4, which reduced the amount of steam entering the intakes. The engine duct's proximity to the ground caused an unusually high volume of steam to be sucked into the A-7A's intake during takeoff. Solutions were developed to address this issue. One involved the pilot closely monitoring the compressor's bleed air ducts. At the same time, another fix saw the Navy applying a new sealant to the carrier catapult systems, which helped minimize the amount of steam escaping from below deck. And despite these efforts, the steam ingestion problem was to tarnish the Corsair's reputation until the arrival of the A-7B, with a slightly more powerful TF-30P8 engine. On the subject of ducts, it was common for the pilot to inspect the turbine blades, and this required them to dive the duct by crawling headfirst down the intake with a torch to check that there was no damage or foreign objects that had gotten lodged in there. Being in front of the duct was a place no one wanted to be when the engine was running. During a cruise of the USS Independence in the early morning, close to 2 a.m., a time when it was almost pitch black on deck, a mechanic who was working on a Corsair inadvertently walked in front of another A-7E, which had its engine running at low power. The intake's suction caught the mechanic and pulled him into the duct. A fellow airman nearby saw what happened and tried to help him, but the mechanic did not survive. The ongoing steam problem, along with operating in a hot, humid Southeast Asia, led the Navy to impose a weight restriction on the A-7A during combat operations, resulting in the A-7A hauling less ordnance than the load for which it was initially designed. The A-7A was never designed to be the fastest flying aircraft, nor the highest cruising machine. It was designed to carry the most ordnance and deliver it further and with greater accuracy than anything that had flown before. Therefore, if the A-7A was going to show off, why not show the world its greatest strength, range, and load? The A-7A's phenomenal range was demonstrated when Commander Donald Ross and one other pilot took off from Cecil Field in Florida carrying external fuel tanks for the Corsair's first coast-to-coast flight. And they flew a pair of A-7As from Florida to Yuma, Arizona. However, when they reached Yuma, they found it obscured by poor weather. They orbited for a while, hoping for the conditions to improve, but after a bit of flying around, looking for a way down, they decided to divert to San Diego, where again they found poor weather prevented them from landing. So they headed back to Yuma, where they just about got in with barely the minimum fuel allowed for landing. What's impressive was that this flight lasted 5 hours and 18 minutes. This would not be the last time the A-7A would demonstrate its incredible performance. When a new aircraft is launched, it is impossible not to consider flaunting it at the Paris Air Show. To that end, on the 19th of May 1967, Commander Charles Fritz and Captain Alec Gillespie launched from Pataxent for a 3,600-mile non-stop flight to the French capital, a trip that took just a little over 7 hours. However, this exhibition of the A-7A's long legs almost came unstuck. As you can imagine, both aircraft had their internal and maximum of 4 external tanks brimming to the gunnels with fuel. The plan was to drop the externals once they had been emptied to decrease drag and conversely increase range, but unknown to them, due to a maintenance oversight, the jettison cartridges had been omitted from one of the A-7A's pylons and was only discovered when they were far out over the ocean. Rather than turn around, the duo made the call to press on, managing to land when they were practically on fumes. However, you'll see later that the A-7A, of which 199 were built, would go on to eclipse even this 7-hour marathon when saving lives over the jungles of Vietnam. 1st of February 1967, the first A-7A squadron, the A-147 Argonauts, was commissioned at NAS Lemoore in California. This was to be the home base for all the light attack squadrons of the USN Pacific Fleet, just as Cecil Field in Florida was to serve for the Atlantic Fleet. Some claim that the VA-86 at Cecil Field was ahead of the Argonauts, but the inter-squadron rivalry would have to wait. War lay ahead. The pilots of the Argonauts flew its first combat missions as part of the Carrier Air Wing from the USS Ranger in December 1967, under the leadership of Commander James Hill, who'd been the first fleet pilot to fly the A-7A. Commander James Hill would lead the Jasons, the VA-147 radio call sign, into their first fight, when on the 4th of December they assaulted SAM sites, flak installations along the highway and bridge targets around Wien, using their 5-inch Zuni rockets. This attack was followed up a few days later with another attack led by Commander W. Scott Gray, who commanded a flight of A-7s against a train south of Hanoi. Gray later recalled,
"We rolled in and literally cut the train in half."
Flight crews from the VA-147 were more than pleased with their new ride, one pilot crediting the A-7 with pinpoint accuracy, although he did state that the Corsair engines
She smoked like a locomotive. The enemy could see us coming before we got feet dry, and maybe right off the cat.
Although we may have been embellishing that a little bit, an innovative solution for the smoky engines was resolved with a few gallons of bleaching additive that the pilots switch on as they approach the target area. The A-7A load for missiles over Vietnam typically consisted of 6 Mark 82 500-pound bombs, 2 LAU-32 7-shot 2.75 Mighty Mouse rockets, and 2 300-gallon underwing fuel tanks, as well as a pair of AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles to keep any local MiGs honest. However, recall that the A-7 was designed to be a nuclear attack aircraft, and as such, could carry 4 types of nukes, from the Mark 28 2100-pound high-yield bomb to the smaller Mark 57 510-pound that could be used as an anti-submarine weapon. On the 17th of December, A-7As, alongside A-4s and A-6s from USS Ranger, attacked the Hai Zung rail and highway bridge complex between Haiphong and Hanoi. This time, they were intercepted by MiGs, which fortunately did not engage the A-7As, most probably due to it carrying those sidewinders. However, on this mission, Commander Hill managed to take out a flak site and put a SAM installation out of commission, all while narrowly avoiding being hit by SAM himself. Many years after the war, an A-7 pilot who had been flying supersonic fighters would recall how dejected he felt when he discovered he had been assigned to the short little ugly fella, as the A-7 had become known in pilot circles.
I was demoralized. I had been a blazing jet jock, and now I was a pilot of a slow, ugly beast. But my unhappiness lasted only until my first mission. Suddenly, everything was different. Suddenly, we were navigating with pinpoint accuracy, and our bombs were actually falling right on target. After that, slough became a term to me, not of derision, but of endearment.
However, the Corsair II was not to have it all its own way. On the 22nd of December, A-7A Buno 153239 was claimed by ground fire. Lieutenant Commander James Hickerson was on an Iron Hand SAM suppression mission with his wingman Lieutenant Dave Carroll. Both A-7s carried a pair of AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missiles to take out the search radar, while an accompanying Corsair dropped their ordnance to destroy the SAMs. The duo was supposed to meet up with Air Force aircraft to troll for SAM sites. However, the Air Force jets did not arrive, so Hickerson and Carroll flew towards Haiphong alone. Once they arrived, they were lit up by SAM radar. Hickerson went after the site, launching one of his Shrikes at it, while Carroll, his wingman, remained high. Unfortunately, the missile failed, forcing Hickerson to launch his second Shrike, although by this time he was above a layer of cloud and did not see the SAM coming at him, exploding beneath his aircraft. The violence of the blast lifted him out of his ejection seat and knocked Hickerson unconscious. Luckily, he came to his senses as the aircraft spun towards the ground, only to discover he was being tossed around the cockpit. With great effort, he was able to strap himself back into the seat and eject from his mortally wounded machine. However, Hickerson was quickly captured on landing and spent the next 5 years as a POW in Hanoi, the first of 5 A-7 pilots to be taken prisoner. Hickerson survived and was repatriated on the 14th of March 1973. The A-7As were pitted against all manner of targets, taking part in varied missions such as the Alpha Strikes, which combined F-4 Phantoms, A-4 Skyhawks, and A-6 Intruders, with ECM and tanker aircraft providing support against single or combined targets. A-7A pilots sat in their roomy cockpits, protected by steel armor plates against frontal fire, while aluminium armor protected him from below, while they engaged in road recce missions in flights of 2 or 4 aircraft, prowling day and night, sometimes for many long hours looking for targets of opportunity, anything they would ignite and explode when hit, mainly trucks on supply runs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. LTV had received a contract from the Navy to further develop the Corsair II with the B version, while production of the A-7A was still ongoing, and squadrons were ending their combat deployments with this type. These original A-7As were stored in Davis, Monthan AFB, and later many were converted to A-7Ps for the Portuguese Air Force. The A-7B, of which 196 were built, was virtually identical to the A version. The most significant difference was that the A-7B was given variable position flaps and, more importantly, an upgraded TF-30 P-8 engine, delivering 12,200 pounds of thrust, 1,000 more than the earlier P-6 turbofan. This gave the A-7B a maximum speed of 681 miles per hour at sea level and a climb rate of around 6,000 feet per minute. It is worth pointing out that the A and B versions did not have the sophisticated avionics for weapons delivery and navigation that were to be found on the later A-7D and E models, although the A-7B got an upgraded AN/APQ-116 terrain-following radar. In 1969, the first A-7Bs were delivered to the initial squadrons on board the USS Enterprise. Also, VA-146 Blue Diamonds, who had already made 3 cruises with the A-4 from the USS Constellation, and VA-215 Barn Owl on board the cramped deck of the World War II-era USS Ticonderoga, affectionately called the Tycho, also received the new A-7B, although the first squadron to take the B into battle was VA-147 Argonauts, the same squadron that took the A-7A into combat. And this was at a time when President Lyndon B. Johnson had imposed one of his numerous bombing halts that plagued and crippled the entire war effort. This meant that whereas before, the pilots could fly from the carrier directly over North Vietnam to Laos to attack those enemy supply columns on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they were now forced to take an indirect route, meaning they had to fly south to avoid crossing North Vietnam, and then west across South Vietnam, followed by a turn north. And this longer distance required more fuel for the attackers, and pilots of VA-26, Fist of the Fleet, from the Tycho, was tasked with flying tanker missions to provide the refueling service. These missions, despite being less than popular, were of vital importance. However, pilots of VA-25 were still understandably nervous about launching their A-7Bs from the wooden deck of a World War II-era carrier with a full load of internal fuel, 3 drop tanks, and a buddy store that included the in-flight refueling pod and hose. One such mission saw Lieutenant Joseph Antonio flying a tanker mission, refueling F-8Us coming off their strikes. After topping them off, he returned to circle the Ticonderoga, ready to offer his services to anyone in need of a fill-up. And this was fortunate, as while in the pattern around the carrier, a Crusader pilot missed the cable several times, and wanting a comfortable cushion of fuel for a few more attempts, or a diversion to Da Nang Airfield, where they had a nice long runway, so hooking up with Antonio's A-7 tanker, he was able to put down on the carrier with a safer margin of fuel. After this, it was Antonio's turn to land. However, the drama was not over. As he lowered the wheels, he received an unsafe gear warning light. Attempting to clear the fault, he cycled the undercarriage a few times, but despite his efforts, the unsafe light refused to extinguish. He flew low past the ship, where his crewmates confirmed the gear to be down. Now Antonio had several options. Take the chance and land on the small deck of the Tycho, which was always a challenge day or night, but more of a challenge when the seas were rough, and today's the waters were especially so. Alternatively, he could divert to that nice long runway at Da Nang. Despite the warning light glowing ominously, Antonio made 3 attempts at putting his A-7B down on the deck, but his now lightened Corsair, having burnt off a majority of the fuel, caused it to bounce, the faulty tailhook missing the cable each time. After a few more failed attempts, he went off in search of a fuel tanker orbiting a short distance away. Fearing that he would not be able to again lower the undercarriage, Antonio left it down. This meant that the excessive drag from the extended gear chewed through his remaining fuel. As he approached the waiting KA-3 refueler, his engine flamed out. Antonio had no option but to eject, landing in the water, where he was picked up safe and sound a few hours later, albeit a little cold and wet. The USAF's choice to adopt the A-7 wasn't well received in Canada. The Canadian Armed Forces had wanted the A-7, but were convinced to go with the Northrop F-5 under the assumption that the USAF would also use this aircraft. Canada's disappointment only grew when the CF-5, as it became known, faced significant early operational challenges. From the LTV viewpoint, the loss of the Canadian order was clearly a severe blow, but this was not the last time a major potential customer chose the A-7 after a long, careful evaluation process and ended up buying the F-5. Probably unbeknown to the Canadians, even whilst the flight test program for the YA-7A was still underway, the Air Force decided that it would purchase the A-7 for tactical air command. Their intention was for the A-7 to replace the Douglas A-1 Skyraider, F-100 Super Sabre, and F-105 Thunder Chief. The A-7D, as the USAF type would be known, was a modified A-7A airframe, of which 459 would be built. And these Air Force Corsairs were a huge upgrade from the original A-7A. For starters, the original 2 troublesome Colt 20mm Mark 12s were replaced by a single M61 A1 Vulcan 6-barrel rotary cannon mounted on the lower left side of the nose, with the muzzle just forward of and under the boarding ladder. This cannon was the same caliber as the previous guns, but with an increase in ammunition from 680 rounds to a 1,000 round drum, where the pilots could select between 4,000 and 6,000 rounds per minute rate of fire. The 6,000 rounds per minute option was if the pilot was in a real hurry to turn something into confetti, but for increased firepower, 3 different gun pods were cleared for use. These included 2 types of 20mm pods, but for extra confettification, there was the GPU-5 30mm gun pod. One of the most significant changes for the USAF A-7D was the replacement of the TF-30 with the more powerful TF-41A1, an Allison turbofan that produced 14,250 pounds of thrusted military power, an engine developed jointly with Rolls-Royce from the RB.168-62 Spey. This upgraded power plant gave the A-7D a max speed of 662 miles an hour and a cruise at 600 miles an hour while hauling 7,500 pounds of bombs. It was claimed that the Tief F-41A1 had a specific fuel consumption of 1/6 that of an F-100 Super Sabre at equivalent thrust. But what really set the A-7D and the E versions apart and made it a favorite with FACs and pilots alike was the navigation weapon delivery system, which was completely overhauled and updated. Such was the system's sophistication that it provided bombing precision that had never before been attainable. The system compensated for everything from wind drift to the Earth's rotation. To simplify navigation, the cockpit had a projected full-color map display screen on which a moving topography of the terrain accurately provided the pilot with the aircraft position at all times. We'll cover the avionics in detail in a bit. Although the first 26 of the Delta series retained a US Navy-style probe and drogue in-flight refueling, all subsequent A-7Ds were refueled by a KV-135 boom via a receptacle in the upper front fuselage. The A-7D was denavalized, having the catapult launch bar removed and fitted with larger main wheels and anti-skid brakes, as the A-7 had a reputation for being a bit squirrely on a wet runway. Interestingly, the larger wheels added an extra few inches to the height. The original steel and aluminium armor of the A-7A and Bs was replaced in the A-7D with a lighter boron carbide armor packed around the cockpit to protect the pilot and more plates around the engine. The aircraft also got self-sealing fuel lines and polyurethane foam-lined tanks to prevent fire from battle damage, although production reduced the internal fuel capacity to 1,425 gallons, divided across 6 fuselage tanks with an additional 1,200 gallons in 4 external low-drag tanks, giving it a range of just over 2,600 nautical miles, meaning that the A-7D could carry more or less its own weight in fuel. For greater redundancy in the control systems, the triple redundant hydraulic actuators were protected with steel plates, meaning that the A-7D could lose 2 of the 3 hydraulic systems and still continue to fly. The Air Force wanted their aircraft independent of external starters, so it fitted the A-7D with a nickel-cadmium battery and a gas turbine starter for self-engine ignition and emergency power, and for additional redundancy, a RAT, or retractable ram air turbine, provided emergency electrical power should the main power fail in flight. The Air Force pilots transitioning from the F-100D loved how stable the A-7D was, and how difficult it was to get the aircraft into a spin, one pilot claiming, "You had to work at it." However, a series of crashes caused the Air Force to ground their entire fleet of A-7Ds, but this was short-lived after the top brass decided that any technical or structural flaw in the aircraft should not delay its introduction to combat. The A-7D maiden flight was on April 5, 1968, although the Allison engine version flew a few months later, in September of the same year. The Delta got its first taste of combat with the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing based at Korat Royal Thai Air Base. The last Delta version arrived in late 1972, which by then, the Vietnam War in its final months was bedlam in both North and South. Initially, the A-7Ds were used to mine Haiphong Harbor and provide night escorts for the AC-130 aircraft patrolling the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Still, their mission scope was expanded further, tasked with flying strikes against targets in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. But it was not long before the value of their endurance, warload, and pinpoint accuracy was put to good use when they replaced the Douglas A-1 Skyraider in the Sandy role. In this assignment, they provided search and rescue teams with the muscle to flatten anything on the ground that might cause trouble. One such mission became legendary when an A-7D stayed airborne for almost 9 hours during an operation to rescue a downed F-105G crew struggling to evade capture. During those 9 tense hours, Major Colin A. Clark and his wingman braved SAMs, AAA, terrible weather, poor visibility, and treacherous terrain. If you want to hear the whole story of this insane mission, subscribe and click the bell icon to get notifications when I release the story covering this operation. The A-7Ds again proved their mettle on the 17th of October 1972, when the North Vietnamese army besieged American advisors and South Vietnamese troops at Mai Thach. They had been defending their position against constant MVA attacks for months. That day, it looked like the position would be overrun until the A-7Ds, supported by Navy A-7Es, came in and pounded the NVA positions for 6 hours with 500-pound bombs and 20mm cannon fire. Over the next 48 hours, the A-7s kept returning until finally the enemy abandoned their positions, leaving most of their weapons behind. In the last 2 weeks in December 1972, the final stages of the Vietnam War saw the Linebacker II Christmas bombing offensive. Initially, the original objectives and restrictions of Rolling Thunder were cast aside, and the full might of the US air power was unleashed on North Vietnam with heavy raids. During these raids, the US Air Force A-7Ds flew alongside B-52s and A-6 intruders, protected by heavily armed F-4s, where the A-7 was deployed as a straightforward bomber, targeting industrial sites, rail yards, radio communication sites, and supply depots in Hanoi, North Vietnam. In the first 10 weeks of combat, the A-7D had averaged 62 daily missions, ultimately flying thousands of sorties. Later missions over Laos and Cambodia increased the unit's sortie total, but at the cost of 5 A-7Ds lost to ground fire. In total, 6 USAF A-7Ds were lost in Southeast Asia, with 2 fatalities. While researching, I found conflicting info regarding the total number of sorties. Numbers ranged from between 6 and 12,000. As much as it pains me not to have an exact number, we'll have to say that whether it was 6, 7, 10, or 12,000, it was an impressive number regardless for such a short amount of time. I wanted to add that in 1972, LTV proposed an anti-armor version of the Delta, named the A-7D-ER for extended range. This version would have had a stretched fuselage to carry more fuel, and the General Electric GAU 8A 30mm 6-barrel rotary cannon, the same one used on the A-10. However, LTV lost to the A-10 in a fly-off in 1972, and the A-10 went on to become a legendary tank destroyer in Operation Desert Storm. Seeing what the USAF was doing with the A-7D, the US Navy decided they liked what they saw, knowing that their Alpha and Beta models needed more power and improved flight systems. They chose to adopt a carrier-based version with a few minor modifications. The Navy kept their Navy-style refueling receptacle and tailhook, but copied the single M61 cannon with the 1,000-round drum, and naturally, they gladly embraced the vastly improved avionics suite with a few tweaks. When the A-7E, or simply Echoes, were being built, the intended Allison or Rolls-Royce TF-41A2 engine was not quite ready. So rather than delay its introduction into service, the Navy decided that the first 67 aircraft were to be fitted with a slightly less powerful TF-30P408 that produced 13,400 pounds of thrust. These aircraft were designated simply as A-7C, a designation that had been proposed for a 2C trainer variant of the A-7A. Other than the standard difference in power plant, the Charlie aircraft were otherwise equipped to the same standard as the Echo. The remaining A-7Es would be fitted with the more powerful navalized TF-41A2 non-afterburning engine, producing a much-needed static thrust of 15,000 pounds at military power settings, giving it a top speed of 693 miles an hour. However, this was a clean airframe at sea level. This version weighed 18,546 pounds empty, around 500 pounds lighter than the Air Force A-7D due to changes in armor and fuel protection. The Echo had an internal usable fuel capacity of 1,476 US gallons, with up to 1,200 additional gallons that could be carried in the 4 external fuel tanks on the inboard and outboard wing sections. The Echo had an additional feature that allowed it to be refueled while the engine was running. The A-7E contract was signed in December 1967, with the maiden flight taking place almost a year later, on the 25th of November 1968, and deliveries began soon after in July 1969. From looking at various sources, the production run was about 535 aircraft, and although the figures vary depending on the reference material, where some quote a slightly lower number. Interestingly, the US Marine Corps, despite the A-7 being regarded as a stable bombing platform, opted for the A-4 Skyhawk as its light attack aircraft, and then onto the Aviation Harrier years later. The A-7E entered service off the Vietnam coast in May 1970, amazingly a full 2 years ahead of the A-7D from which it derived. Yeah, I had to look that up a few times. It seemed strange that the aircraft it was based on took longer to develop. Anyway, so the Echo entered service with the replacement air group VA-174 Hellraisers and started combat operations with the VA-81 Sunliners and VA-83 Rampagers aboard USS Forrestal, along with VA-146 Blue Diamonds and the original operators of the A-7A, the Argonauts of VA-147. As mentioned earlier, it was the avionics that really made the Deltas and Echoes stand out above the older models and the definitive A-7s. These systems allowed the pilot to attack enemy targets, where sometimes they were just across the road from friendly troops. Before the A-7, no other aircraft had been designed with such a sophisticated navigation or weapons delivery system, dubbed the ILAAS, or Integrated Light Attack Avionics System. At the time, the only other Western aircraft of the era equipped with a remotely similar capability was Sweden's Saab 37 Viggen, which first flew on the 9th of February 1967. At the heart of the A-7 ILAAS system was the IBM AN/ASN-91 Tactical Navigation/Weapons Delivery Computer, which constantly received data from various electronic sources and controls. From this data, navigation was calculated 5 times a second, and weapons delivery solutions were calculated 50 times a second, and used to steer the aircraft and drop weapons. Now, this computational power may not seem like much by today's standards. However, it was the difference between hitting the bullseye or dumping the bombs in some random field. One of the system's main components was the AN/ASN-90 inertial measurement set that sensed the rotation in the aircraft's basic 3 axes and velocity changes for navigation and weapons delivery. Along with that, the AN/APN-190 Doppler radar continuously measured and displayed the ground speed and drift angle. This information was used in reference velocity for the inertial measurement set and as a backup navigation information. Early A-7s were equipped with a multi-mode radar, but the D&E were upgraded to a forward-looking radar, or FLIR, integrated into the ILAAS digital navigation system, and provided the pilot with 9 different modes of operation, including air-to-ground ranging, terrain following, and terrain avoidance, but the naval version had an additional mode that provides signals for aiming the Strike anti-radiation missile. All this valuable info was displayed to the pilot via a British Elliott Aerospace ANAV-Q7 heads-up display, the first modern heads-up display in any American combat aircraft. It received and displayed the flight data, weapon system info, and an AN/ASN-99 projected map display system, visually depicting the jet's track across the ground. This system enabled its pilot to navigate to the target to deliver his ordnance and then guide him either home or onto 8 other pre-selected targets, or mark potential targets that could be revisited on later missions. The tactical computer took inputs from the various systems and translated them into the guidance commands for the pilots. Once in the target area, the pilot would receive steering data on his HUD, and all the time, the computer would calculate bomb trajectory. Once in position, the computer would signal weapons release. It could be said that the A-7D and Es were the first smart aircraft to deliver dumb iron bombs. Although the pilot was still expected to handle a fair amount of work, operating all of the systems on each mission, constantly keeping all the gadgets tuned and updated, this workload resulted in formations of A-7s flying in loose crews, allowing each pilot to keep an eye on all the systems while maintaining a safe distance from each other, an issue that was addressed in the FA-18 Hornet. The Navy's A-7E pilots demonstrated to the enemy the accuracy of their superior systems firsthand by going after targets in Vietnam irrespective of the weather, day or night, or defenses, and placing more bombs more accurately either automatically or in manual mode.
A-4 and A-7As, pilots would tell their FAC, "We have 8 Mark 82s, and we can give you 15 minutes."
Recalled Lieutenant Bob Beck, an A-7E pilot, following up with,
"They weren't really good bombers. With our echoes, our circular error rate probability was less than 50 feet. Fax loved the A-7E. We had 12 Mark 82s or 6 Mark 83s, and we could give them both time and accuracy. We had radar ranging that was extremely accurate."
Not only did the Echoes make the FACs happy, but the troops on the ground were highly impressed with its weapons delivery accuracy and the ability to eliminate threats on the first pass with bombs dropped, sometimes within 10 meters of the target. On the 22nd of January 1971, Lieutenant Beck was flying a mission in support of the American invasion of Laos to crush the communist supply routes when he received a call from an FAC telling them that they were needed to assist a Marine platoon that was under heavy fire that was preventing a medevac helicopter from getting in.
"You really have to do something, but it's going to be awfully close,"
urged the FAC. Beck's flight lead wanted to drop his bombs in return for a strafing run. This was denied by the controller, who was rightfully concerned that a strafing run would bring the A-7Es within small arms range. Instead, they went in and dropped their bombs. On their way back to the carrier, the FAC called up,
"Do you want the body count?"
to which the flight leader responded,
"We don't get body counts."
but the FAC continued regardless.
"We have 75 guys who are real happy."
Later reports showed that 30 of the enemy was eliminated by the attack. The nature of the A-7 missions, flying low, hugging the terrain, lured in pilots who discovered that the mud-moving air-to-ground strikes could be just as exciting as flying supersonic in a Phantom or F-8U. To move the mud, the ordnance was carried on 6 external stations. The outboard wing stations was stressed to carry 6 250-pound bombs, 3 on each wing. The 2 inboards could carry a total of 12 500-pound bombs, and various racks and adapters allowed it to carry every ordnance item in the NATO arsenal. Also, launch rails were mounted on each side of the fuselage and were designed to carry defensive missiles, which routinely carried a pair of AIM-9 Sidewinder IR missiles. These rails were limited to 350 pounds on the Navy A-7Es, while on the Air Force version, 500 pound could be carried. The ordnance loads could be complex, to the extent that the Air Force Flight Manual dedicated over 50 pages to the store combinations. It seems that the most common Air Force mission payload was generally 8 Mark 82 bombs, 2 Sidewinders, and 1,000 rounds of 20mm ammunition. In April 1975, Corsair wings from USS Enterprise, Coral Sea, Midway, and Hancock provided cover during Operations Eagle Pull, the evacuation of Phnom Penh, then followed shortly by Operation Frequent Wind, which saw the evacuation of Saigon in the final days of April 1975 as the Communist forces conquered the South. Although the A-7 has never shot down an enemy aircraft, it was considered a capable fighter whose 4 US Navy A-7s were lost to enemy fire, the combat loss rate for the A-7E being roughly 30% lower than for the A-7AB, primarily because of its much better weapon delivery accuracy, allowing a single-path attack. However, during the 63 months the A-7 had been involved in Southeast Asia, 45 aircraft had been lost across Corsair squadrons, along with 44 more A-7s being put out of action due to operational mishaps, such as failed catapult launches, damage during landings, and engine failure. 15 A-7 pilots lost their lives in action, while 8 died during operational mishaps. 5 Corsair pilots were taken prisoner, 2 of whom died in captivity. However, the A-7 wasn't finished in Southeast Asia just yet. On April 30th, 1975, the Corsairs were once again called into action when the SS Mayaguez, an American-registered cargo ship, was seized by the Khmer Rouge naval forces in international waters off Cambodia's coast. The ship's captain, Charles Miller, and his 39-man crew were taken prisoner. President Gerald Ford, determined to avoid a repeat of the 1968 Pueblo incident, where the failure to use force swiftly led to an 11-month hostage situation, ordered immediate military action to rescue the crew. P-3 Orion reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched to locate the Mayaguez. Once confirmed that the ship had been anchored at Koh Tang Island near the Cambodian coast, A-7 Corsairs from the USS Coral Sea were launched to cover the Marines and helicopters assaulting Koh Tang. In support, Air Force gunships sank 3 Cambodian patrol boats, preventing them from transporting the Mayaguez crew from the island to the mainland. 2 U.S. helicopters were shot down during the operation. Still, one Marine survivor, who served as the battalion's forward air controller, used an Air Force survival radio while swimming to direct A-7 airstrikes against enemy positions until the radio's battery died. Despite being isolated on the island, the Marines utilized their 81mm mortars for fire support and set up a makeshift communication network to coordinate additional airstrikes by USAF A-7s and F-4 aircraft. The operation ultimately claimed the lives of 41 men, 2 Navy corpsmen, and 14 Marines who dived during the fighting on and around Koh Tang, including 23 Air Force personnel who lost their lives in a helicopter crash in Thailand while preparing for the mission. On August 15, 1975, Major John Hoskins and Captain Lonnie Ratley flew the final U.S. bombing missions over Cambodia. Piloting their A-70's Corsairs, they dropped the last U.S. 500-pound bombs and fired the last shots of the war north of Phnom Penh against the Khmer Rouge, expending the last American ordnance in Cambodia. That same day, civilians listening to their radios overheard a conversation between a U.S. command aircraft and forward air controllers.
It's really been good working with you.
Voice crackled,
Yeah,
went the reply.
see you in the next war.
Then came the muffled sound of a harmonica playing Turkey in the Straw, followed by silence as the planes headed back to their bases. After Vietnam, the A-7 did not see any action until they were called upon in 1983 to participate in the invasion of Grenada, a small Caribbean island, in Operation Urgent Fury, where a military coup backed by Cuba had just overthrown the government. Fearing for the lives of hundreds of U.S. citizens who were attending medical school on the island, President Reagan, the Gipper himself, decided to intervene to protect the students, restore democracy to the tiny nation, and eliminate an ever-increasing Cuban presence in Grenada. This was at a time when the world was focused on events on the other side of the world, with the terrorist bombings of Marines in Beirut. U.S. Navy A-7Es from the USS Independence provided close air cover, flying nearly 300 sorties to support American ground forces, dropping conventional iron and rock-eye cluster bombs and strafing targets with their Vulcan cannons. Navy A-7s also provided air support during the U.S. mission in Lebanon in 1983, where an A-7 and an A-6 intruder were shot down by Syrian surface-to-air missiles on the 4th of December 1983. The A-7 pilot, Commander Edward Andrews, managed to guide his failing Corsair over coastal waters before ejecting. He was rescued by a Lebanese fishing boat and safely returned to the U.S. Marines. The A-7s would also see action during the Gulf of Sidra dispute with Libya. A-7s operating from USS Saratoga responded by launching the first AGM-88 HARM missiles ever used in combat. On the next day, A-6s attacked Libyan warships approaching the U.S. fleet, while A-7s had again launched HARM missiles against Libyan SAM sites. During Operation Desert Shield, the USAF sent their A-10s while keeping their A-7s home. At the same time, the Navy's deployed 2 of its last A-7E squadrons on board the USS John F. Kennedy to the Middle East, where they were both used for night and day missions deep into Iraq. Each of these operations could make entire videos in their own right, which I'm considering. If you want to see these, please comment below. On October 20th, 1987, a U.S. Air Force A-7D crashed into the Ramada Inn near Indianapolis International Airport. On that day, the A-7 operated by the Indiana Air National Guard, being piloted by Major Bruce T. Garden, was flying at 32,000 feet over the Indiana-Ohio border when he notified controllers at Indianapolis International Airport that his aircraft had sustained some sort of engine failure about 15 miles southwest of the city. As his engine failed, he started a glide-in approach to Indianapolis to attempt an emergency landing. At first, there was confusion between air traffic controllers and Major T. Garden, whose initial distress call was blocked by radio calls from other aircraft. Once controllers at Indianapolis were able to communicate with Teagarden, they vectored him onto runway 5 left, contrary to Teagarden's wishes. They instructed him to increase his sink rate to give him maximum runway, but due to the low cloud ceiling of 800 feet above the ground and poor visibility conditions over Indianapolis at the time, Teagarden was still at 3,100 feet when he overflew the runway's threshold, so he was forced to make an alternative plan to land on runway 32 instead. Teagarden turned right to head east away from the airport, but continued to lose altitude, descending from 3,100 feet to 2,000 feet, just to the east of Interstate 465 at the airport's eastern edge, where controllers lost him from the radar scope. As his altitude continued to drop, Teagarden pointed the A-7 towards a barren patch of land before being forced to eject from the aircraft 500 feet above ground. Now powerless and pilotless, the aircraft made a slight left turn as Teagarden watched helplessly as to what his A-7 did next. The Corsair grazed the rooftop of a nearby building before bouncing back into the sky. It then crossed a street, collided with an embankment, briefly became airborne again, and finally crashed into the front of the airport Ramada Inn. The impact sent the aircraft's cockpit and engine hurtling into the hotel's main lobby. The jet fuel ignited, creating a massive fireball that engulfed the hotel's front to the 4th floor. Meanwhile, the plane's wings shredded into the building's upper levels, scattering debris across the carport below. Just 1 minute after the crash, fire trucks from Indianapolis Airport arrived. They quickly deployed foam to douse the flames, successfully controlling the fire within minutes. Simultaneously, other airport rescue teams began searching the building and aiding in the evacuation, which the Ramada Inn staff and guests had already started. 7 Ramada Inn employees fell victim when the jet struck the lobby. 2 additional staff members perished from smoke inhalation after being trapped in the hotel's laundry area. Other injuries were reported among guests, one of whom succumbed to burn injuries 10 days later. Additionally, 2 firefighters and a Major Teagarden were also injured in the crash. An investigation addressed the difficult decision made by Major Teagarden to eject. While he survived the crash, his decision to eject so late was aimed at avoiding further casualties. Although the crash resulted in significant loss of life, it was widely believed that the death toll could have been higher if the plane had crashed in a more densely populated area. The final Air Force report, published in January 1988, concluded that a malfunction in the accessory gearbox caused the engine failure. A gear failed, leading to the drive shaft tearing into the lubrication system, which caused the engine to seize shortly after. To complete the story of the A-7 development for the US services, the A-7K 2-seat trainer version of the A-7D was produced for use by the Air National Guard. Following the conversion of one A-7D, 24 A-7Ks were built from scratch, with deliveries beginning in April 1981. While updating the A-7, most A-7Ds and A-7Ks were fitted with automatic maneuvering flaps and pave penny laser trackers in the intake lip for use with the laser-guided bombs. In the export field, the A-7 did not do as well as it deserved. After being chosen by the Canadian Armed Forces to no avail, the A-7 was then selected by the Swiss Air Force to be called the A-7G. As a de Havilland Venom replacement, simply because it could deliver a heavy load of bombs from a longer range, with fewer losses to ground fire and greater accuracy than any of its competitors. However, the Swiss government intervened and insisted on buying the cheaper F-5E. Then, to add insult to injury, the Carter administration sank a plan to transfer 100 used Sloughs to Pakistan due to US opposition to its nuclear program very late in the day. So late, the rumor has it that at least one Corsair had already been applied Pakistani markings. LTVs finally broke into the export market with an order from Greece for 60 A6Hs land-based A7Es and 5 2-seat TA7Hs, where H stood for Hellenic, replacing their Republic F-84 Thunderstreak. With deliveries starting in 1975, were the only foreign users to obtain new production machines. These aircraft were powered by the TF-41 A400 engine, which provided 15,000 pounds of thrust and operated by the No. 347 Squadron Perseus at Larissa, and by number 340 and 345 Squadron at Suda Bay. In 1993, the Hellenic Air Force received additional A-7Ds and 19 T-A-7C surplus USN aircraft, which entered service with 335 and 336 squadrons, replacing the F-104G. The last of the much-loved and admired A-7Hs were retired on October 31, 2014, from the 336th Bomber Squadron. Portugal was the second export customer, who purchased 50 ex-USN A-7As, which LTV refurbished and modernized. The initial 20 airframes for this conversion were chosen from 28 airframes stored at AMARC, 8 of which would be used for spare parts, since, by that time, these aircraft already had between 2,000 and 5,000 hours of flight time on their airframes. These renovated A7s created the A7P standard, where P stood for, you guessed it, Portugal. 6 T-A7P later bought were also former A7A airframes converted to tandem twin-suite aircraft for training and operational pilot conversion that had the same capabilities as the A7P except the cannons, which were replaced by an oxygen system. These aircraft had the TF-30P408 engines and retained the two 20mm cannons while being fitted with the avionics suite, heads-up display, and navigation system of the D and E versions. Deliveries of the first 20 machines began in 1981, and the remaining 30 arrived in 1984. The A-7P served with No. 32 Squadron, replacing their F-86 Sabres, where they would be primarily used in air interdiction and tactical air support maritime operation missions. The A-7P was also used in the air defense role, a task for which it was not suited, and therefore, strangely, until the arrival of the F-16 in 1994, Portugal had no effective national air defense. During its 18 years of service in the Portuguese Air Force, the A-7 fleet suffered 14 accidents and numerous maintenance and logistics problems in its last years due to the lack of spare parts and financial difficulties. The last Portuguese A-7Ps and T-A-7Ps were retired in 1999. Last but not least, the Royal Thai Navy received several surplus A-7Ds, Es, and TA-7Cs, along with a mountain of spares in 1995. There are various numbers out there being quoted, some say 20 and some say 18, and were in service with the 104th White Shark Squadron. These aircraft are no longer operational. I read that the Royal Thai Navy maintains the aircraft operability with the necessary maintenance by starting them up and taxiing them. If anyone knows if this is correct, please comment. By the end of the Vietnam War, the USAF had begun to transfer their A-7D to the Air National Guard and started the development of their own close air support aircraft, presumably not wanting to rely on Navy designs. There were tentative plans for a supersonic Corsair III, an upgrade for the Air National Guard, fitted with the General Electric F-110 GE100 afterburning engine, but this never left the drawing board. In 1974, the Fairchild A-10 was selected as the replacement for the A-7D, with the first A-10s being posted to the 354th TFW in 1977 at Myrtle Beach AFB, followed by the 355th TFW at Davis-Monthan AFB, replacing their A-7Ds in 1978. The US Navy started to phase out their A-7E in the mid-1980s with the arrival of the McDonnell Douglas FA-18 Hornet. The last Navy A-7s were retired by the last fleet of operational squadrons, VA-46 and VA-72, in May 1991, shortly after their return from Operation Desert Storm. By the end of 1998, except for some airframes used as static displays, all US A-7s were disposed of by the AMARC at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. Some aircraft leave a lasting impression. The A-7 is a pilot's aircraft, a flyer's aircraft. Some in the USAF insist it was retired too early in favor of the A-10, although many in the US Navy were more than happy to jump into the faster, agile FA-18 Hornet. However, for many veteran A-7 pilots, the Slough will always be their first true love.